Hi, it's Mo. In August, I talked so long and so much about the books that I read in August, I had to split my monthly reading wrap-up into two parts. So I do these videos vlog style where I talk about the books that I've read throughout the month as close to when I've read them as I can. Usually it ends up not being that close, just due to circumstance, due to life, but I try to talk for only about 5 minutes. I tell you a little bit about the book, I tell you what I thought of it, some themes that I noticed, if I liked it, and maybe you can decide if you would like to read it too. Or, better yet, if you've already read it, let's have a discussion down in the comments. So this is part 2 of my August wrap-up. You can see the first part listed in the description box below, and this is, I think, a little less than half of the books that I read in August. So, like I said, sit down, relax, enjoy this vlog style reading wrap-up. And so let's get back to the original footage. It is August 24th, and I have read 7 more books in August, I think. The next book that I read in August was Stay True by Hwa Soo. This is a memoir of the author's time growing up in the 90s, and it specifically revolves around coming of age and growing up and friendship and finding one's identity and how identity is influenced by others. The author was, I'm not sure how you say his first name, Hwa, kind of a snob and kind of a person who took pride in being different than other people. So like specifically this talks about how he liked Nirvana, but then once Nirvana got popular, you know, he no longer really listened to Nirvana. Like he listened to it, but it wasn't cool anymore. And how he bought all his clothes from thrift stores, and he looked down on people who like bought their clothes at the mall. He hated people who listened to Pearl Jam. How he clung to those things for his identity, those things that shaped him, yes, but the kind of opposition of the other shaped him a lot. And then he met his best friend, one of his best friends, who was everything he was not. He shopped at the mall. He only wore thrift store clothes to like a Halloween party. You know, he listened to Pearl Jam. He was like the opposite, but they became very close friends, best friends, working on projects together and communicating. And this friend really showed the author how things could be different and still valid and still good and still cool. Kind of shook up his like deep-rooted ideas that he had set out for himself. When that friend is killed, our author has to go through and unpack not only the grief, not only the death, not only the loss of this person, but what that means to their identity and how their identity changes and how their self-identity, what they think of themselves and what's important to them and what they think of the world, how that changes. So it was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. It was read by the author. I listened to this book on audio, but I'm glad that I had the physical copy because I didn't even realize that there are photos in here until I picked it up after I was done listening to it. He speaks about the photos, some of the photos in this book. So some of the lens of looking back in this memoir, some of the device of it is by looking back through photographs and different things and seeing how those things were significant in his life. I think this specifically resonated with me because we were growing up around the same time and we were into some of the same things. He was a little bit older than me, so he was coming to that kind of music and those kind of realizations a little bit older than I was, but I definitely loved the like 90s nostalgia and loved being able to look at this memoir and think back about my time finding those things or doing those things or being the person who wore thrift store clothes when no one else did, or being the only person in my high school who wore ripped jeans and everybody thought I got into a fight because it just wasn't cool at that time. And so the idea that your identity is created a little bit by being uncool or not being popular, not doing the popular things really resonated with me. So I definitely think this one's worth it. Very, very interesting. Lot to do with grief, lot to do with self-identity, lot to do with coming of age, lot to do with how our friends and the people around us influence us for good or ill. And it was really sad. Definitely made me cry. You know, it's super sad. read, but I really loved it, and I would look out for more from this author, either nonfiction or fiction work. Really enjoyed the writing as well. I will say that our author is not sometimes the most likable because he is very pretentious, because he is very snobby, but I kind of enjoyed that. The next book that I finished in August was Mother Country by Etaf Rum. This is the first book by this author that I've read, and this is a very short story, and I'm glad to have read it. I'm interested in Etaf Rum's other works, but I was always hesitant because they are very like domestic, very heteronormative. Etaf Rum is Palestinian, I believe, and they do write a lot about what that experience is to be like torn between traditional Palestinian beliefs and morals and mores and growing up American and in America. And this book, Mother Country, is about this. The main character is speaking to her mother and talking to her mother and asking her mother questions, and she's returning to see her mother after a long period of time where she hasn't seen her mother. So she's kind of asking her like why she was raised the way she was and why her mother made the choices she did and why she didn't give her the affection and attention and love that she wishes she had, why she stayed with her father who was abusive, why she married her daughter off, the main character off, at such a young age and didn't like warn her about some of the consequences of those things. And it was a lot for a really short story, and there was a lot of really interesting insights into, you know, second generation immigrant kind of experience and that idea of being caught between two cultures. I think that's something that I read a lot of and really enjoy, and I think this was another good one. I do think that I probably won't, I'm trying to get in here. I do think that I probably won't remember a ton of this later. Like, I did really enjoy it, but it's not something that's going to stick with me in the long term. But partly that is because it's a very short story. Hi, do you want to come in? You can if you want. But I love these short stories, as you will know, because they let you taste test authors. So I will definitely read more Etaf Rum in the future. And if you're interested in those themes, if you're interested in that idea, this is definitely very like sad in a lot of ways. It's definitely, you know, not super easy to read. I will say that besides the spousal abuse of the mother, there's not too much that's like really horrible necessarily. And none of it is like very graphic or depicted on page. It's hard subject matter, but it's not the most graphic. So I would definitely suggest giving it a listen. The next book that I finished in August is The Autobiography of a Sexually Emancipated Communist Woman by Alexandra Kollontai. This is a Russian translated work. This edition doesn't have the translator, so I will put it down below. I had to Wikipedia it. I guess this is, you know, an older book. It was written in 1926, and I think it has been republished and redone many times. So I guess I see why there's no translator, but I will look it up again and I will put it in the description box below. So this is a kind of open letter, short memoir. It's unclear whether this is the full memoir or pieces of the memoir from this little edition I found in a little free library of Alexandra, who was a like slow aristocrat, like wealthy woman living in Russia, and then she got married and she decided that that really wasn't for her. She had one child and she loved her child, but she wasn't like super into the motherhood life, and she didn't get along with her husband, and she decided to leave him and take her child. But of course a lot of political stuff is going on in Russia in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and she gets more involved in the politics of the Bolsheviks and the various different political movements that are going on at that time with Stalin and other people. And so the more she learns about the idea of autonomy, the more she learns about the idea of equal rights, the more she learns about the idea of communism, she gets further and further into the movement and becomes extremely involved in the women's suffrage movement. And so this little memoir is kind of, you know, the aims and worths of my life. Like, it's all these little sections of her life, of what she did and why she did it, the years of political immigration. She eventually does have to leave her child behind with family friends and flee Russia and go to other places, and it was really interesting. One of the things that I really liked about this was that in this edition, it says in the beginning that there were a lot of things left out of wherever this eventually ended up. This has the original notes, so they were able to put in italics the things that she left out, like that she crossed out. You can tell by that this was very delicately written and censored and rewritten so that it wouldn't offend too many people, because like her life was in danger a lot of the time and she was a notable political figure for a long time. So, you know, the attempts on her life or the idea that she was in danger is very like apparent from the text, which I thought was cool. It was an interesting way to look at it, a good way to see it like in a more physical manner, because it made you go back a lot of times and reread a sentence, omitting the italicized part, so omitting what she omitted, to see that like a lot of things were written in a way as not to draw attention to like being a woman or her gender identity or her future plans and things like that. And then I guess sexually emancipated just means that like she had other lovers and she had other relationships. It doesn't go into like any kind of gory detail. Now, communism I have like a very basic understanding of, a very rudimentary understanding of, but the timeline of a communist and the different political parties I really had to look up. Like I didn't really know who the Bolsheviks were. Like I've heard that word spread around and I didn't really know the timeline of all the different people like Lenin and Stalin and all those people. So I did have to do a little bit of research to put this into more context, but I like barely scratched the surface. I could not explain it to you now. I'm not going to remember it. It would be like a super interesting thing to like take a course or a class or a lecture on to learn more about. But I thought it was a really interesting pamphlet, little memoir of just a role of experience that I'm not as used to. This does remind me a little of other women writers that I've read and people living at this time in the late 1800s to early 1900s that were in whichever suffragette movement they were in, whatever liberation women's rights movements. But because the women's rights that she's fighting for are communist rights, it's like kind of an interesting addition to all those other books that I've read. So I think it's totally worth the read. I could have read this in just a few hours. I ended up reading it over a day or so, but it didn't take me very long. It's very, very short. So interesting piece of history to know more about. The next book that I finished in August was The Dinner by Herman Koch. This is another translated work, and this was translated from the Dutch by Sam Garrett. This is a work that takes place in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. This all takes place from the perspective of our main character, who is the husband in a couple, and this couple, he and his wife Claire, he does have a name, but I can't remember what it is, maybe Paul, are going to dinner with another couple, and the whole thing is very much in our main character's head, and it's very much like how he really doesn't want to go to this dinner, how he's really dreading it, how the guy who he is going to dinner with is so pretentious. He's in Parliament and he's like really annoying and stuck up, and he's took a wine trip and now he knows everything about wine, and how he's going to order for them, and how he's going to be obnoxious, and how he's going to be pretentious, and how he wanted to go to this little cafe and meet there early because it's like a regular person cafe and he wants to be seen as a regular person. So our main character hates this guy. You know, it's very obvious that he really doesn't like him, that he's really stuck up, and that he really doesn't want to go to this dinner. And as we learn these things, and as we see our main character go to this cafe before dinner with his wife, we learn a little bit more about his relationship with his wife and how much he loves her and how revered she is in his mind, and just very sweet and like loving and wonderful things that he says about her. And we also learn that he has a son, and so we learn about how our main character's relationship is with his son and how much he loves his son, and we get little glimpses through memories of the son's childhood. We get little glimpses different times in this family's life through remembrances, through memories. The book is separated into different courses, so aperitif and then appetizer and a main course, blah blah blah. As the dinner goes on, as you learn more about these two couples, as you learn more about their relationship with each other, you also learn that that other couple has children as well, and you learn about the relationship of all these children together. And it kind of comes to light that the reason that they're having this dinner, and that the man in Parliament, the friend of our main character, wanted to have this dinner was to talk about the kids. Even though our main character is very complimentary about a lot of things, there's a lot of things he doesn't like as well. There's a lot of things that he talks negatively about. There's a lot of different instances in his life that we learn about that could be construed negatively. And as the book goes on and as we round towards dessert and stuff, we really find out like the crux of what this dinner was about and why these people are here, and it might go in a direction that you weren't expecting. So I think it's best to go into this book with not knowing very much about it. This was made into a movie, and I do not want to watch that movie, but I would be interested to see how they did it, because this very much is all in the head of the main character, and it's very much his thoughts and his projections and his ideas and his view of everything. So I wonder how they did that, you know, obviously not being in someone's head because you're in a movie. So I think that would be really interesting. The reason that I don't want to see the movie is the reason why I didn't like this book. I think it was an excellently written book, or not excellent, but I thought it was a very well written book, and I thought it was really good at doing what it wanted you to do and making you feel the way it wanted to make you feel and evoking the emotions and thoughts that it wanted you to think. But I didn't like it. Like, it's very icky. It's an icky book. It's a like frustrating book. It's a book that, again, I get, but like I don't want. I guess. It reminded me a lot in the feelings that I got of The Door by Magda Szabo. So that is like the most frustrating book I've ever read, and I loved it, and I thought it was great, and I liked the book overall, that book. I can't say I don't like this book because it was well done and it did what it was supposed to do, but I didn't like what it did. I didn't like what it made me feel, even though it was supposed to make me feel that, and it did the right thing. It did the good job of doing that. I just didn't like it. Whereas The Door made me feel icky as well, made me feel annoyed and frustrated and angry, but I left it feeling like, wow, that was a great book. That was an amazing book. I loved that book, even though I hated that book. And this one I left feeling like, I never want to read this book again. I don't want to see the movie. I don't want to know anything about it. I hated this book. But it doesn't make you sympathize with an experience. I mean, I think it does a good job of repelling you, but I just didn't like it. But I would definitely, if you're interested in like something that's going to be thought-provoking, something that's going to be well written, something that's going to be translated, so have some like cultural differences, and then also some cultural things that are universal that you might understand, I would definitely check it out. Just know that it's gonna make you feel gross. It's gonna make you feel gross. It's gonna make you feel icky. The next book that I finished in August was The Survival of Molly Southbourne, which is Molly Southbourne 2. They said it on the audio, Tade Thompson. I always say Tade Thompson, but I think it's Tade. So Tade Thompson is an author that I've read from before, and I obviously did read The Murders of Molly Southbourne, which is the first Molly Southbourne book, and in The Survival of Molly Southbourne, we are actually starting exactly where The Murders of Molly Southbourne left off. I love Molly Southbourne. It was my favorite book of the year that I first read it, which I think was 2021. And then I just reread it last month, or the month before, last month I think in July. Reread it on audio. I read it physically the first time. So The Murders of Molly Southbourne follows Molly Southbourne as she grows up with a sort of affliction that affects her life. And then in The Survival of Molly Southbourne, we're picking up at the very end of the first book, and we're seeing how she now has to learn to get along and learn to survive and learn to re-navigate life with all the events events that have happened in the first book. So a lot of things happen in the first book that change the course of this Molly's life, and how Molly needs to still figure out what's going on, because there's a lot in her life that she really doesn't understand still, and then also figure out how she's going to move forward. And then there's one more in this series, which I don't remember what it's called, but I'm excited to get to that one. I love these books because they're very short and there's no fat on them. You know what I mean? Like, everything is important. Everything needs to be said. Everything is to further the plot and to further the character development. And for such short books, there is quite a bit of character development, and you care about some of the characters and you want to see some of the characters return. And then in the second book, there's quite a few new characters that are introduced that you want to know the outcome of, and hopefully we will learn more about in book 3. So like, they're so lean. They're so exactly what they need to be, but there is so much action in all these books. There's so much gruesome things. There's blood and guts and fighting and gore. There's pretty disgusting moments in both of these, and in the second one there's a really gross moment, which is interesting because it kind of leads off of a real crazy revelation in the first book, and then you get the outcome of that revelation, and it was like perfect, you know? So I really enjoyed the second one, and I look forward to eventually reading the third one. And these books are like 115 pages each, so if you need something short, a short horror, something that's going to shock you a little bit, something that's going to entice you, and something that's gonna, for me at least, stick with you, I would definitely highly recommend checking them out. The next book that I finished in August was a poetry collection, The Last Time I Saw Amelia Earhart, and this is by Gabrielle Calvo-Caresi. I was cat sitting at my friend's cat Gus, and they have a poetry shelf. They took it away for a while. Now they brought it back, and I was so happy. This is just a random book of poetry that I picked up. It just sounded interesting. I loved the title, and there is a titular poem inside. I thought this was great. This is one of my favorite poetry collections that I've read in a while, and I definitely plan on finding a physical copy of this because I definitely plan on rereading it, and I really want to read more of Gabriella's work. Gabriella, I believe, is from like Connecticut or something, but in this book she talks a lot about Ohio. The themes of the poetry are very much about like working class, about communities kind of coming together. Like in the titular poem about Amelia Earhart, it's divided. It's a long poem over many pages, and it's divided into all the different people and the last time that they saw Amelia Earhart. So like, you know, you might get someone who was her doctor, you might get someone who was her friend, you might get a bystander, you might get her fourth grade teacher or something, and it's kind of how these people all live in a community and how this event of Amelia Earhart's flight brought them together and what that meant for the community. I mean, it's poetry, it's not prose, but you find little glimpses of the community within these people's account of the last time they saw Amelia Earhart. And she has quite a few poems like that, but in all the poems you get this glimpse of the environment of the town that the poem is set in. There's another reoccurring poem called something like At the Adult Movie Drive-In. So the first one is kind of just glimpses, scenes of an adult movie drive-in, but then that poem, that name of that poem, is repeated multiple times in this collection, so maybe there's 5 or 6 poems called that. The more you read them, the more glimpses you get of, and a more complete picture you get of the adult movie drive-in. Her poems are like vaguely sexual, some of them. They're a little bit like darkly erotic, some of them. They're unsettling. This whole collection felt very much like horror. It felt like Shirley Jackson. It felt like small town horror in a lot of ways. Not every single poem, but as like a whole, it was like very unsettling. You got a very unsettled feeling. You got a very Twin Peaks vibe from the overview of what all these poems were about. I like that in a lot of these poems, because they were broken up into multiple parts, the last line of the first part would be the first first line of the next part. And I just thought it was overall like an amazing collection. So if you're looking for poetry that reads like horror, I would definitely check that out. It was incredible. The last book that I've read so far in August is Going Out with Peacocks and Other Poems by Ursula K. Le Guin. This is another one that I read while I was cat sitting. I brought this one from home though, because I've been meaning to read this Ursula K. Le Guin collection for a while. I didn't realize until after I read this one that she has quite a few collections of poetry. I've only ever read Cat Wings, which is her middle grade young adult series of fantasy books about cats with wings. So I didn't know what to expect from this one, and I thought it was interesting. It's not my favorite ever collection of poetry. It's broken up into different sections, and a lot of the poems have to do with nature and kind of being out in nature and seeing nature and experiencing that. Another section has to do with social justice and things that she sees kind of in life, what's going on around her. That section is called Fury and Sorrow. And this one has like a written for the AIDS walk in Portland, 1989. It has a poem that was written for Tawana Brawley, who I had never heard of before and I had to look up after, but she was a young girl who claimed that she was raped and then was later judged that that was not true, but seems pretty much like it was true, and it was just covered up by the white people who had raped her. So there's a lot of interesting connections that Le Guin has to people and places and things in this collection. I mean, I guess Le Guin is most known for sci-fi, and there is a small section called Dancing on the Sun, which I would say we're a little bit more in a sci-fi realm, but not exactly. So I thought it was a really interesting collection. I enjoyed it. I don't think any of the actual poems are going to stick with me as much, or the storytelling of the poems are going to stick with me as much as just like my overall enjoyment of it. Whereas the last time I saw Amelia Earhart, like, I'm going to remember those poems because they were stories in and of themselves, and there was like a whole storytelling vibe to be connected with there. Whereas I didn't necessarily feel that way with this one. But I did really enjoy this collection, and I look forward to reading more Ursula K. Le Guin. I wonder if this collection would be more meaningful if I had read more of her other works like The Dispossessed or The Left Hand of Darkness or things like that. Always have to read more poetry though. I'm glad that I've gotten to quite a bit of poetry this month, and then also a lot of translated works. I said it was August 24th, but it's actually August 25th. I will probably finish more books in August, and when I do, I'll let you know. It is September 3rd, and that means it's time to do my wrap-up of the wrap-up and talk about the last books that I read in August. The next book that I read in August was Death Takes Me by Cristina Rivera Garza. I have never read anything by this author, but when I first saw it on my friend's coffee table, I thought that I had, and so I asked if I could borrow it. She read about a quarter of it, and she decided to put it down, so she was like, yeah, just go ahead and take it. So I was able to take this one, but when I opened it, I realized that this was not the person that I had read from at all. I was thinking of Maria Ganza. So I think I just confused Garza with Ganza, and it being a book that was translated from Spanish. I had been wanting to read this, so I was glad to pick it up. This book is a mystery of sorts, kind of a psychological, esoteric, philosophical mystery, but it is also basically one long poem or a book of poetry. It follows several people, a writer and a teacher who is named Cristina Rivera Garza, who is a poet, and it follows a detective. It kind of follows the detective's assistant, and then it also intersplices with other people. So we see some men who are involved, we see a reporter who's involved, and then at the end we see a publisher who's involved. Death Takes Me is a very nebulous, loose, poetic novel about murders that are happening, and the first murder was discovered by one of our main characters, Cristina Rivera Garza. So this teacher and poet is running, and she runs all the time. She runs everywhere. Everywhere she needs to go, she runs to get there. And she's running, and she finds a man dead in an alley, and he has been castrated, and his member is missing. So she calls the police, and the detective comes, and that's where our other main perspective comes into it. Like I said, I think during the main part of this story, there's also a third perspective from the detective's assistant, because we see things about the case from his perspective. But this is really more about like life and poetry and the intersection of different lives, and then also about people's introspection about death and how they think about death and how they see connections throughout life and death to various things in their life. And then there is, in that first major section, what the heck was that? No clue what that crash was. But in the main portion of this book, we also meet a reporter and kind of another third kind of main character, or another main character is the poet that all these people kind of think of when they see these murders, because more than one murder happens, and it reminds them of a poet and a visual artist, and the poet is quoted at the scenes of the crime, and then it reminds them of this visual artist, and they wonder what the intersection of these crimes and art and poetry and life are. In the end, we see a kind of memoir, or I guess the first part of the book, being sent to a publisher. And I think it's worth noting that because this book is very nebulous, so to know that it meanders in and out of different people's lives and different timelines and different ideas about what's going on is probably good. And knowing that it's basically like one long poem, and it's written in a very experimental style, in a very unconventional style. It doesn't have a conventional ending, it doesn't have a conventional middle, it doesn't have a conventional through plot. So I think going into that, you kind of have to know. I could see why my friend got frustrated with it, because you in the beginning kind of think maybe that won't be the case for the entire book, but it is the case for the entire book. I thought it was interesting. I didn't think it was a favorite of mine. I don't think a lot about this book is going to stick with me, except I do think that certain aspects of the characters might stick with me. For instance, the professor running everywhere I thought was like an interesting touch, an interesting concept. So like there were definitely things that I enjoyed about this, but I didn't overall think it was the most amazing. I think mostly you have to read it for just being immersed in this kind of poetic, experimental style, and I did enjoy that. The last book that I finished in August is Lady Rights a Wrong, a Manor Cat Mystery by Eliza Casey. Earlier this year, I believe, I also read the first in this series, which is A Lady Takes the Case, and this is about Lady Cecilia, who is a noblewoman or aristocrat in England in the early 1900s. And in the first book, she meets Jane, who is the maid of a rich American woman who comes to England to meet the family, Cecilia's family, and stay at their manor house. And then Cecilia and Jane form a bond and a friendship, and they also have a bond with Jack, who is a stray cat that Jane finds on the ship over from America. So Jack does play a role, and these definitely could be considered cat cozy mysteries to some degree. It's not as cat-centric as I would like my cozy mystery, but this one had more Jack in it, and it had more Jack helping with the case in it, I think, than the first one did. So I would call these cat cozy mysteries, but I'd call them cozy mysteries with a cat element. I enjoyed Lady Takes the Case, which is a murder mystery, and I liked Cecilia's character, I liked Jane's character, and I liked the way they helped each other solve the mystery, and then the little touch of like that manor house, early 1900s, Victorian feel, the kind of Downton Abbey kind of feel of this. These could at some point almost feel like young adult novels because Cecilia is quite young. I think she's only 19 or 20, but to me they just felt more like cozy mysteries in that way that cozy mysteries are very accessible, very easy to read, very fun, very light, even though there is death and murder. In Lady Rights a Wrong, a suffragette comes to the little town that Cecilia's family live in, and Cecilia's super interested in this because she's trying to decide like what her life is going to be like and what she's going to buy into from her history of aristocrat family or not. Is she going to be a modern woman? Is she going to learn to ride a bicycle and do things that women just don't do? Of course, her mother is completely opposed to this, but other people in her life are not. And then it does continue the story of Jane and Cecilia and then some of the other people that we met in the first book. So I really enjoyed this one. I think these are super fun, easy to read. I read both of them on audio and I thought they were both really fun on audio. I think the first one was written in 2019 and then the second one was written in 2020. So I don't know if we're going to be getting another one, but I hope we are because I do really like this series. So if Eliza Casey or anyone involved in her is out there and want to know if people want another one, we want another one. So those were all the books that I finished in August. I forgot to mention that Death Takes Me was translated by Sarah Booker and Robin Myers from the Spanish. So it was Women in Translation Month, and I did read 3 books by women in translation. I also read Apartment Women, which was translated from the Korean. And then I did also read another translated work with The Dinner by Herman Koch. This was a good book, but I didn't like it. And then I also read some books that I thought were quite bad. I read some nonfiction, some memoirs. I read my second John Darnielle, and I really liked this one. I've been thinking about it still. I read some mystery books. I read a few poetry books, which I'm super happy to have gotten back to. I read like kind of a long anticipated read, which was interesting, but not exactly what I thought. And then I read a book that I wasn't really anticipating, which I thought was interesting. So like there's a lot of diversity in this list. As far as the style of books that they are, poetry, modern classics, contemporary, mystery, cozy mystery, nonfiction, horror. I read another memoir for Garb August. So I read a lot of different things and I really had a fantastic reading month. I really enjoyed my reading month. I didn't get to read as much for Garb August as I would have liked. And actually I would have liked to have read more for Women in Translation as well. But like any of these months that highlight different people or different style of writing or different types of writers, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, you can read them every month. So you might as well read more Women in Translation when it's not Women in Translation month. And of course, we can always read more garbage, read more trash, as Ollie would say. So let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!